Hello, everybody. Welcome to Trial and Error, a webinar about trial and error, learning how to podcast.
About DIY podcasting at Arthur Newspaper. My name is Nick. My pronouns are they, them.
My name is Brazil. My pronouns are she, her. And we're the current editors of Arthur Newspaper, the Trent University and Peterborough-Nogojiwanong Independent Student Press.
Feel free to put questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll get to them at the end. But yeah, so podcasting is, only a small part of our job as co-editors. We would love for it to be a bigger part of our jobs. But there's a lot involved in running a not-for-profit and managing a staff that falls outside of actually doing journalism.
So when we first came into this job, we were a few months into what is now a year-long global pandemic. And it was still in that phase of the pandemic when people were still wearing gloves to go to the grocery store. People were definitely not trying to pick up newspapers in public spaces. And Arthur didn't really have a great infrastructure for basically any form of media outside of print. So we knew that we had a lot of work to do in bringing Arthur into, I guess, the 21st century and making sure that Peterborough and the students still had a source of independent media, because it was definitely needed at that time.
We had both been involved with Trent Radio throughout our undergrads. Brazil was president of the board. I worked there for a time. We both had several shows. And because of those experiences, and because Jill and Rob at Trent Radio were so good at adapting during those early days in the pandemic, we knew that we could turn to radio to offer a familiar and COVID-friendly format for sharing the news. We thought, hey, we can just podcast our radio show on our website. It's that easy. And with that, Arthur had its very first podcast.
So the first radio show that we did as editors was called A Hot Arthur Summer. And it was recorded, edited, and produced in an extremely sweaty closet in a spare bedroom of Nick's student house on George Street. We could see Trent Radio right across the street, but unfortunately the closet had no windows. But it was that close. We tried to line the closet with blankets and coats in an amateur attempt to soundproof the space, but we were recording on a Zoom recorder, so we were passing it back and forth, and we had no microphones. We would take breaks in the middle of recording because it would get so hot in the closet that we couldn't keep speaking. And yeah, as soon as we were able to be in Sadler House again, we jumped at the opportunity to start recording there because it was much, much better than recording in this closet. And eventually Trent Radio was able to lend us some microphones that we now use to make our voices sound buttery smooth. The moral of the story, I guess, is that you should switch your setup a lot until you arrive at something that works for you. And what we didn't realize at the start is that it's really good if you're physically comfortable while you're recording, because if you're not, you can hear it. Closets are not good audio studios. I'll give you that much advice, I guess. And yeah, we're still working towards our most ideal setup, but we're a lot closer now than we were 9 months ago, I think it's fair to say.
For sure. I definitely remember being worried that our Zoom recorder would get like water damage because I was sweating on it. Hot Arthur Summer. So in these sweltering early days, the podcast was definitely more of a radio show. Neither of us had ever made a podcast, but we'd made innumerable hours of radio. I'm not sure we had thought a great deal about how these two audio formats differ from one another and how much becomes possible when you're not broadcasting live. Because of this, A Hot Arthur Summer really is a radio show that we podcasted. It was set up like a variety show, segments on segments on segments. Because of our propensity for radio, neither of us had a tremendous amount of audio editing experience either. So the early iterations of Arthur podcasting definitely reflect this. We would record each segment in full, and we'd only really edit these chunks if it was really necessary, aka if we'd been just like laughing chaotically in the middle of a recording. So editing was really just a matter of kind of splitting the recording up into the different segments and throwing some music in between. Shout out to Sportsman Lucifer for our musical stylings from Hot Arthur Summer all the way up until now.
And I'm going to play a little bit of episode 3 of A Hot Arthur Summer. You'll notice that there are 30 full seconds of silence before the episode actually starts because we actually didn't know how to properly mix the audio. But here we go. We're nearing the 30-second mark when we start being able to hear.
Wait for it.
Welcome.
That's a hot Arthur Summer if I've ever seen one.
Welcome to episode 3 of A Hot Arthur Summer. I'm Brazil.
I'm Nick.
We probably already introduced ourselves, but here we go again.
We definitely did, but you can't get enough of us.
I feel like we've been catching our stride a little bit. We've been editing down our process. We've been self-critiquing deeply.
A lot of reflection, meditation, a lot of vision boarding, a lot of getting in the
mood
groove.
Boarding even. Both vision and mood boarding.
Most definitely. So here we are to deliver the news, other things, maybe babies, poetry, weather, weirdness.
And other stuff. So I think that's a good place to end, but yeah, I'm not sure if it was the hot summer air that turned our brains to soup or a factor of our naivete at entering into audio journalism, but A Hot Arthur Summer was deeply silly. We used to write weather updates in haiku. We would read poetic horoscopes and we'd make up satirical headlines based on real news events. We even had an opinion section where we'd ask our audience, and mostly our friends, which were our audience, for their hot takes of the week. So if you were webbed toes are the next big thing, another was Magic Mike XXL is basically Homer's Odyssey, but better and for the 21st century. So while this was a radio show attempting to also be a podcast, and it was really fun to make, it was sometimes successful and occasionally futile attempts at humor that ended up teaching us a big lesson, which is being funny is really hard. And what makes someone laugh can be a really subjective thing. It can be difficult to create those very specific conditions you have to create to have humor that everyone understands and enjoys when you're attempting to appeal to a wide audience, which we were at the time. And if you don't get it right, humor can be really alienating as well. Who would have thought that? But so eventually we took a hiatus from being funny, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But these reflections brought us clarity on the nuances of writing for radio versus writing for a podcast.
Writing for radio is very different from writing for a podcast. Radio presents an interesting paradox. On one hand, it demands preparation and research. You really have to map out what you want to talk about in advance of broadcasting. But on the other hand, it really allows for a certain kind of spontaneity, as you would have heard in that last clip. I don't think that the gulping recording was planned in our script. But yeah, sometimes we would just write the word discuss into our script after notes for like a given news story and just kind of have a discussion. And those more conversational parts of A Hot Arthur Summer are probably the best of what it has to offer. Writing for the podcast happens in a more piecemeal fashion now. So you can't really write a script or plan out the entirety of an episode until you know what you have to work with. This means that you need your raw materials first. So you need to do your background research, you need to conduct your interviews, you need to sift through what's been said, decide what through lines will shape the like narrative structure of the podcast. So there's a lot of like working as you go and writing as you go and editing as you go.
Another reason that A Hot Arthur Summer was so silly is that we hadn't yet found the confidence in our own voices we needed to take ourselves seriously. I personally used to experience visceral cringing at the sound of my own voice during those very early audio editing days. And while we're still refining our audio journalism voices, I've stopped cringing at the sound of my own voice. And I think that counts for something. Another thing to keep in mind as we transition into talking about the next phases of the podcasting journey that we're on is that every episode of Hot Arthur Summer was researched, written, recorded, and edited in a single workday. So that definitely added to the kind of mania experienced in the whole process.
Yeah, as you can see, caffeinate is a step in the recording process. It comes right before recording, and that is real. We would like guzzle coffee because we just had to channel our like most energetic selves.
It's the only way it sounded good.
And even then, gulping. So fall came, and so did a new season at Trent Radio, which meant that we had an opportunity to give our podcast a name that really encapsulated all of its curiosity and nihilism. What's the point? Early What's the Point is very indicative of the conversations we were having about the podcast, you know, slowly moving towards a more polished, professional, palatable product. Got to get all those P sounds in because I'm not using a microphone. That's a big thing. P sounds in the microphone. You got to watch those popping Ps. But these early episodes of What's the Point retained all of the silliness and segment kind of setup that Hot Arthur Summer had as well. So in the fall, it became a lot more difficult for us to produce a weekly podcast episode, radio show that we were proud of. In the summer, we had spent at least a whole workday writing, recording, editing, producing the podcast, but with autumn came the tripling of our staff and a lot more responsibilities outside of the space we'd carved out in Arthur for these audio projects.
Yeah, we were in a bit of a tricky spot because we'd worked on A Hot Arthur Summer long enough and listened to enough podcasts to finally kind of know what we wanted our podcast to sound like, but we just didn't have enough time in the day or the week to make it happen. So we were able to kind of talk to the kind, patient, and understanding friends at Trent Radio and take a little bit of time away from being on radio every week to kind of reimagine the What's the Point radio show and podcast a little bit. And that's something that really helped us at this phase is that listening to a lot of podcasts and a lot of podcasts that covered a variety of topics and had a variety of styles. And we just thought a lot about what we enjoy as listeners and also what might be possible to achieve as creators and in the time that we have and with the facilities we have.
So this January, again, we kind of overhauled our audio production system. If you haven't already noticed, along with a just do it attitude, there's a running theme in our creative style of always be reinventing the wheel. And while being fixated on innovation might seem laborious, this deep self-crit allowed us to learn a lot about, you know, audio storytelling, audio journalism, and here we are.
Yeah, we decided during that time that we wanted to be more polished. During the fall semester, we were spending too much time producing each episode, at least a day or day and a half. And there were a few problems. First, they weren't up to the standard we'd wanted. We just didn't have enough time to brainstorm, to write scripts, to record with energy and sound good. Also, the editing had to be pretty quick and dirty. And so there were often like these little inconsistencies, or it just didn't sound perfect or the way we'd want. And yeah, we just didn't have that time to make it sound great. I guess finally, and most importantly, we just weren't reaching enough people to justify how much time it took up in our week, especially with the amount of staff and other things we were doing. It just felt like we were putting way too much effort into this kind of small part of our job. So for our new polished podcast, we wanted to rely mostly on research and/or interviews. We wanted to focus entire episodes on one topic and do them right. This meant planning out our whole semester week by week, and we did that in January. So that we'd know when our interviews were scheduled for, and we would block out a full day for editing, and we kind of share that duty as well. This also meant switching to a bi-weekly schedule with Trent Radio, where we repeated our episodes week to week.
So our new system requires a lot of time and energy in the storyboarding phase, doing research, mapping out the narrative structure, figuring out who we're going to talk to, writing the script, all that jazz. And slowing down really allowed us to turn the podcast into a bit of a longer term project, and dig into specific topics in ways that we couldn't before. So our first episode was on Tom Simons, the founder of Trent University, who passed away in the early hours of January 1st. For this episode, we interviewed 3 people with a close relationship to Professor Simons and Trent University. 2 were former research assistants, one of whom was his administrative assistant for 17 years. We also interviewed Dr. Michael Eman, principal of Trail College, who had a close personal and professional relationship with Professor Simons. This episode was really daunting to make because we wanted to produce something that did justice to this incredible person who had such a full life and who we have so much admiration for. And, we wanted to do justice to our interviewees and the incredible stories that they had about Professor Simons. And so I think this episode really taught us the importance of taking your time to listen to everything that your interviewees have said and build a narrative structure, with those words. And that takes time. It's a really contemplative thing sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Especially with this topic. So we're just going to play kind of similarly to how we played a bit of Hot Arthur Summers intro. We're going to play the intro from this episode of What's the Point?
This is a special episode of What's the Point, an audio project by Arthur Newspaper, Trent University's independent student press. I'm Nick.
And I'm Brazil.
And you're listening to an hour on Professor Tom Henry Bull Simons, founder of Trent University. Enjoy. If you've ever attended Trent University, you've probably heard the Simons name. Of course, Trent's main Peterborough campus shares a name with its founder, THB Simons. Perhaps you were fortunate enough to be part of Trent's early cohorts and got to know him as the president of your small, collegial, interdisciplinary university.
Yeah, so that's just kind of the first couple seconds of that episode. And that episode and then subsequent episodes we've done in 2021 have honestly been a huge amount of work. For example, in this episode, we coordinated 3 separate interviews. So I'll just kind of run through what we did to kind of build that 40 minutes of radio. But yeah, so we coordinated 3 different interviews, and we had to make sure the questions that we asked each of these people were both focused on their personal relationships with Tom Simons, but also pertain to the broader themes we wanted to talk about and tie together so they would actually fit together. Also, during the interviews, we had to keep our interviewees on theme, help our guests be as articulate as possible, but also be really sensitive to the subject at hand, which is the death of a very important person in their lives. After the interviews were completed, we had to clip these hours of interviews into these small thematic chunks, so ranging from even 40 seconds to 8 minutes of speaking. And then we have this process of writing out all of these sticky notes that represent all of the thematic chunks, and we have a numeral system. And then we arrange the sticky notes on a big piece of paper to kind of build a narrative structure. So because the flow of how you're going to tell the story really depends on what people say and how it relates. Yeah, you just want to figure out how to draw them all together, and it's really hard when you're just looking at an Audacity file, for instance. So during this part of the process, we engage in like building the narrative at every phase. So we're both constructing it and reconstructing it at different points in the process. And we've realized that you really have to be prepared to pivot narratively at any stage, because there are tons of changes that happen along the way. And especially when, we're not working with a huge amount of experience in this. So things change a lot. So maybe the interviewee doesn't come to the conclusion you thought they would when you were initially building up your questions. Maybe you discover something in your kind of secondary research when you're writing your own script that throws light on some aspect of the conversation you had with the interviewee, and you maybe either want to follow up with them, or you have to change what you're going to say in your own script. Maybe you just don't know what the story is going to be until you're kind of at that really final stage when you're recording your own part of the podcast. And this, for our jobs, this makes promotion really difficult, because we don't always know what story we're kind of selling to the audience until it's actually like almost done, until we've already recorded it and we're kind of doing that final edit, and you kind of realize, oh, this is the takeaway. It takes so long to get there. And yeah, you just don't really know that big main idea until you're writing the script that's going to kind of tie that whole thing together. And it's really the final editing stage. Like if you were writing an article, it would be like that final copy edit stage that you'd know what the article's about, which doesn't happen when you're doing writing as much, I guess.
But sometimes you do have a pretty solid idea of where your interview is going to go. I find this happens when you're really familiar with the interviewee. I was fortunate enough to watch an entire season of reality TV in which my interviewee was featured for this podcast, episode 11 of What's the Point, Priyanka. So I got to interview the winner of Canada's Drag Race, which was a huge honor and privilege and just like pleasure. It was so much fun. Priyanka is the most engaging and yet still like larger than life and down to earth person I have ever met virtually. But in the lead up to this interview, I watched almost the entire first season of Drag Race all over again. And I took notes. Like I watched Drag Race as research for this podcast. And I know earlier you mentioned having taken a bit of a humor hiatus, but episode 11 of What's the Point definitely marks our return to a like fun and light subject matter. Which can surely be owed to Priyanka. We're gonna play a tiny clip.
I'm fucking dead. Like I'm actually so done with you.
On this week's episode of What's the Point, find out why Priyanka is done with Nick.
That's right. We managed to get the inaugural Canada's Drag Race champion, the one and only Priyanka, on the show.
You are listening to What's the Point, an Arthur newspaper.
Yes, that's just a little taste of that episode. It's one of our shorter ones, so I definitely recommend checking it out.
Yes, please You'll have to listen to me laugh throughout because Priyanka is just like so funny, but yeah, it's worth it's worth it. So where are we now? I think we feel better about our show because we're making less of it and we get to spend more time in each phase doing that kind of refining work. Though we often get to the writing phase and kick ourselves for not doing more research before doing the interview. And that's just kind of like a symptom of having so many different moving parts to our job constantly. In a perfect world, there'd be endless time for research and follow-up interviews. In a perfect world, we would have time to listen and refine the structure multiple times.
Yeah, and we're trying to get closer and closer to that perfect world with every new episode. One of our most recent episodes, we lost almost half the audio at the very end stage of the project. So that, not a perfect world scenario, but we're getting there. Right now, we're really figuring out how to improve our flow. That's kind of our goal for our summer endeavors. Part of this is hopefully commissioning some music that will help the show feel more cohesive. We have some ideas, like wanting to create different transition sounds and introductory and concluding themes that all kind of work together to create a cohesive sound. Because I think that one thing we noticed when listening to podcasts and doing that research is that music can be one of those things that not only ties a show together, but moreover, well, or also when it's bad or not on theme or poorly edited, it can be really distracting. When it's good, on the other hand, it's the thing that really makes you sound polished, like in combination with a good microphone and good editing. But this is really hard to do when you're working with editing software you don't really know, which is what happened to us at the very beginning. And when we were trying to kind of like transition from, getting used to the faders at Trent Radio and then transition into doing it in Audacity, which is just a completely different thing for your brain to do. One tip that really helped me that Jill Staveley told me in the summer was when you're thinking about music and transitions is to just close your eyes and listen to as much as you can, because especially when you're a really visual person, you can get caught up in all the waveforms that you see on the screen, but you've got to kind of train your brain to just do that listening work and just hear what's going on.
I think another part of music is realizing that it is part of like the actual narrative structure of the episode. Like I think there was a time where we saw it as kind of like complementary, but I think now we know it's like really imperative and kind of has to be woven into the script in that way.
Mm-hmm. Ideally, it really holds up what you're producing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think our main conclusion is if we can do it, so can you. You saw where we started, literally in a closet, sweating, and here we are in a room sweating. So yeah, it's possible. But yeah, here are some pictures, and yeah, we're ready to talk about any questions you might have. I saw some pop up in the chat, but I actually don't know how to get there.
I think
there
it's
it
here.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can also enable people's microphones if you use the raise hand button for any attendees. I can allow you to speak. But yeah.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Sweet.
So Katie asked how we find appropriate music for themes and sound bites. Well, yeah, I think we've been really lucky. During the summer, we were using some music from library albums. So we didn't do the CanCon thing as much, but we were just kind of using that to kind of like fill out the background of our A Hot Arthur summer episodes. And now we have a musician that has made us a bunch of songs, but they're not we use that kind of jazzy one that we played, you might have heard a few times in our clips. We use that one a lot, and it does get repetitive. So we don't do a lot of kind of transition sounds, but we do use it as like an intro and outro. So yeah, we don't have a ton of music or variety right now, but yeah, the person that makes music for us is in Canada, making it in Canada. So and it's all instrumental, so that helps. But there are, I think asking local musicians is always a good idea. It's possible people will just have instrumental things that they can share.
I feel like Trent Radio has some really good resources too in their archives as well.
Yeah, like if you need to stick with CanCon, it might just be a matter of putting a bit of time into looking through the archive reaching out and just picking a few things that work, and then you'll just have them forever, downloading them, and you'll have them. You can just mix it up, because it's not, I don't think it's necessary to change your music up all the time.
I had a question for you guys. So you guys publish a print newspaper as well as make these podcasts. I wondered if there were any circumstances where there was information or interview quotes or anything like that that worked better for a podcast or better for print. And do you want to talk about writing and putting out journalistic pieces for both media?
Yeah. So that has been a big learning curve, I think. I think I personally am still kind of figuring out what works better for written journalism as opposed to audio. I love to write really long form, like 3,000 word articles that no one's ever going to read. And so I think part of what I'm like loving about podcasting is that there's so much potential to do that kind of long form work and have it be more accessible, because I don't know, we all spend a lot of time on computers, and it can be hard to like have the attention span to like read something that is 3,000 words. I know I struggle with that sometimes, coming up from work, not having the bandwidth to like sit down and do that. So I really love listening to podcasts just as like an audience member. And so I think thinking about keeping my audience member in mind when I'm thinking about a story, and kind of helps me guide, whether it's better for audio or for written stuff. And Brazil's good at reminding me, like, this is probably a good podcast thing.
Yeah, I guess I might be a little biased because I really love podcasts, and I love the way that storytelling happens in podcasts. I think that there are kind of a few scenarios in which podcasts are like a superior medium, but I think it's also up to interpretation. I think for one, something that is going to be more light and humorous really does work as a podcast, because I think people often use them as filler when they're going from place to place, and being able to kind of like, I do think that the Hot Arthur Summer stuff that we were doing worked as a podcast, because there wasn't a ton of like hard-hitting content, but there were lulls and swings up, and I think that worked. And I think another scenario where something works well as a podcast is when that the person you're interviewing has a really strong voice, and that if you were to write about them, you might just end up quoting them extensively, because that definitely happened when we were interviewing. I mean, we set out to do the Tom Simons story as a podcast, but we really just kind of sewed their stories together. We didn't add a lot of our own work in between, and that was the best way to do it. If we'd written a story, it would have really benefited from quoting people extensively, and that's not always the most fun to read, because you can't always like read things in different people's voices, or it's sometimes hard to present it in a really like distinct way when you're quoting people and really share their personalities. But with a podcast, those personalities come through a lot in full force.
I couldn't imagine like writing an article about interviewing Priyanka. That just like would not have worked at all.
And just the humor just wouldn't have come across as much. I think Katie asked a question about what editing program we use, so maybe we'll just answer that one. Yeah, so we use Audacity, which is a free program, and I think it's great. I find it very visual, which is easier for me to use than a program that wasn't as visual. But Nick used to use Reaper. Like we first started, I was using Audacity and Nick was using Reaper, and that was kind of a whole mess because we couldn't really pass files back and forth between our programs. And Reaper is a lot more has a steeper learning curve, I think. But yeah, I would recommend Audacity, especially if you're new to doing this kind of work, because exactly the editing things that you'll need to do is remove likes and ums, is fade in and fade out. And those things are extremely easy to learn in Audacity. I think I know like probably 0.1% of the things that you can do in Audacity, and I still like can do all the things I need to do. So I think it's a great program for beginners.
Yeah, Reaper, I feel like if I knew how to use it, it would have been great. There's so many features. I just was so new to audio editing that like now that I'm using Audacity, I'm like, it's a lot easier just because I'm so new to audio editing, like as even a concept.
And I guess in terms of editing out filler words, sometimes you have to listen through the whole thing to get them. I don't really know any other ways. Sometimes I can, if a person has a very specific speech pattern, you can see where the ums are, and then that can help speed up your process. But mostly you have to listen through your whole episode and remove them.
Also, I feel like you also like something to keep in mind is that you don't have to edit out ums and ahs, because I was talking just with a friend about podcasts, and she was saying how she actually doesn't like listening to podcasts that have like a super high production value or they're not super like conversational, because she just like wants to have that kind of like familiarity, that casual kind of relationship with the podcast hosts. And recently Brazil went through for our TCSA podcast. Brazil went through and edited out like all the ums and ahs and pauses, and because they were like interviews for people running for office, they were very nervous. There was a lot of ums and ahs happening, but we were like trying to be very generous to our interviewees because we knew they were so nervous, and we made a promise to them that we would make them sound as eloquent as we possibly could. I would advise against making that promise.
Never promise that you'll make people sound good.
No, but yeah, it depends on the context for sure. Are there any other questions or comments? Anything people just want to chat about? I guess we've gone a bit over time, but we'd love to talk about anything.
Caleb asks, what advice do you give your interviewees before recording?
I think one of the main things is just trying to make them feel as comfortable as possible. Just because if people aren't comfortable, the conversation won't flow. The quality of the conversation just won't be there. And so a lot of it is kind of like this interesting game of like making sure that it's not a game, it's just it's like an ethical obligation that we have, but like kind of establishing some kind of rapport and some baseline level of like trust in those relationships as like interviewer and interviewee, and like doing the whole like we'll make you sound good, like we that was a joke. We do always try and make our interviewees sound as best as we possibly can, and I think that helps too, knowing that they can just kind of speak freely and casually, so that
Yeah, and I think it's a delicate balance between giving them I guess, leaving auditory space between you speaking and them speaking so that you can edit your voice out if you need to. And emoting and talking to them and responding to what they're saying. Like, it's really important that you do that, or it does feel a lot like an interview, and it can be more stifling. So I think one thing that we've been talking about a lot in recording interviews is, figuring out how to kind of balance the audio that you're producing and being like too hyper aware of how it sounds and how it's sounding as it's being spoken about or spoken out, and also just like being present and being sure that you're being human with the person so that they don't feel alienated, because that's the easiest way, I think, to ruin the audio anyway. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and depending on the context, sometimes you really want your interviewee to like be really prepared for the interview, so you might send your questions ahead of time, or there's some instances where they don't need to be like super well researched. It can be kind of more conversational, and then you also want to give them at least a general idea of what the conversation will kind of be about. Katie's asking, what's the position of Arthur Hour? Are you airing What's the Point on Trent Radio? Do you want podcasting to continue for Arthur? Yeah.
So Arthur Hour is the radio show on Trent Radio that the previous Arthur editors, and I think the past few Arthur editors, have done. So that's just mostly, it's been kind of like up to the Arthur editors, basically like what they want Arthur Hour to be, but it's often interview based, or they'll read news, they'll talk about what's going on. And that's kind of, we adapted Arthur Hour to be a hot Arthur summer when we first came into the job. I think that, we are airing What's the Point on Trent Radio. So that is kind of like the next iteration of Arthur Hour. But in terms of the last question, I definitely want to keep podcasting with Arthur, because I think we've honed some skills in audio journalism that actually benefit the accessibility of Arthur's work. I think people absorb a lot of their media through podcasts these days, and I think it does benefit Arthur to have that as a way that we're connecting with people. And I would love to even expand our capacities to train some staff writers to produce audio journalism, because I think like it is, if people are going to be journalists, audio journalism is a really viable way to do that as a career.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the journalistic work we want to do this summer is kind of through a bit of an investigative lens, which I think podcasting can really lend itself well to. So keep an eye out for that. Something else Arthur really wants to start doing in terms of the podcasting realm is hosting other podcasts on our site. So we already have the Black Girls Chatter podcast available on our website. That's produced by Shay and Alicia McLeod. So, check that out as well. We're going to be having another podcast available on our site very soon. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can let the drum roll happen for that one. Maybe should we unveil it right now? But so we are just looking to host audio storytelling, audio journalism content on our website. Now that we have this really great website that we can have, a variety of different kinds of media on. Thank you, Danny Taro, for being a really great web designer. But we really want podcasting to be part of what Arthur does, but there's no way we want to build that infrastructure so that it can continue beyond our time at Arthur.
I saw Will had his hand up, and Will, you're able to talk now if you want to. I don't know if you're speaking, but I can't hear you. I see your mic's unmuted, Will, but we can't hear you for some reason.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's up either.
I feel like he's typing.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So we'll just wait for that.
While we're waiting, thanks everyone for tuning in.
And thank you, Peterborough Independent Podcasters, so much for giving us this opportunity. It's been great.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it.
It's been nice to just reflect about Will's question. Can you speak to the difference between in-person interviews and Zoom interviews? Yeah, I really, really, really miss doing in-person interviews. Yeah, I think that what's really hard with Zoom interviews is, finding that balance between being able to be conversational because, with the technology, sometimes there's laggings. Sometimes it's just difficult to read the social cues through the screen and know when someone's thought is finished, when they want you to jump in, kind of thing. I think that has kind of thrown a bit of an extra element in the kind of interviewing process. I think it just means that you have to do a lot of added work of monitoring the technology and the audio, because it really does throw in that technological component. Are you recording using just the Zoom recording? Are you recording just their audio through the Zoom? And yeah, so that, and yeah, I just miss speaking in person with interviewees, just being able to connect in person about what's going on. There, so many of the interviews I've had have been some of the most interesting conversations I've ever had, and I miss having those conversations in person. Yeah, but it also made way, I would never have been able to interview Priyanka. I keep bringing up Priyanka. I love her. I can't stop. But that wouldn't have happened if not for Zoom interviews. So it opens up possibilities as well. But I do look forward to being able to conduct interviews in person again. And Katie asked, how do we allocate budget for What's the Point versus Arthur newspaper? Which is funny because we don't really have a budget for.
What's the Point doesn't have a budget.
Aside from
we spend no money on it.
Our membership with Trent Radio.
Yeah.
But yeah, we found our recorder in this cabinet in the background, this Rom-Tom original, and the batteries were exploded or whatever, and we had to clean it out and cross our fingers that it works. It half works. It's really finicky. There's a lot of rigmarole, and we've lost a lot of audio because of all of its nuances, let's call them. So that, yeah, maybe next volume there will be some money in the budget for podcasting. Yeah, well, agreed. You can really hear the love that Michael, Catherine, and oh my goodness, I'm blanking on our other interviewee's name. Wow. My apologies. Yeah, you can hear the love that they have for Tom Simons in their voice. It's very poignant. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we should wrap up When can we expect?
This is
Well,
a very good question.
so Katie asks, when can we expect the next episode? And we've decided to not produce any more episodes for the rest of the year because we're running a fundraiser next week.
The rest of the year being the rest of
the school year, sorry.
Yeah.
So just until April. And then we're going to take a hiatus from Trent Radio this summer, but we'll still be producing audio journalism. And yeah, we're hoping to, work out some way to get it broadcast on Trent Radio at maybe during a special project time or something like that. But we won't have a regular show throughout the summer. And I think the next episode that we'll actually have on Trent Radio will be rerun, and then the audio from our fundraising telethon that we're doing on April 1st. And that is a telethon where Nick and I will be reading the news. We'll be dressed up as news anchors.
Yes, we should plug that. Come to our Arthur's first annual fundraiser and telethon, April 1st, 8 p.m. We're going to make some posts about it. It's going to be fun.
Well, thanks so much, guys. That telethon is going to be on twitch.tv/Arthur Newspaper, right? So people should check that out. And yeah, thank you guys for doing this. It's been great to hear about your journey. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming as well. The session's going to be up on YouTube right now once I hit end, and we'll just wrap it up there. So thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Aisha. It's been a pleasure.